Something about Paul just doesn't seem to add up. For nearly 2,000 years, Paul has shaped Christianity more than anyone else. More than Peter, James, and John. More than any of the original disciples who actually walked next to Jesus. His letters define salvation and righteousness for billions of people. And yet, Paul never knew Jesus directly. Instead, Paul received a private revelation, a vision, years after Jesus died. And that alone raises a question that most discerning Christians are afraid to ask. How much authority should this one man have if he never knew Jesus personally? In this video, we're going to look at some of the main claims that people bring up against Paul, and we're going to look at the arguments defending him. Now, I can't cover everything in this one video, but I'll do my best to squeeze in as much as I can while keeping my points clear. If you doubt Paul's trustworthiness, then this video is for you. One of the biggest arguments against Paul is that Paul created a new religion entirely separate from Jesus. They each had their own gospel. Jesus taught that the kingdom of God is near and people are invited to live in it now. According to Jesus, salvation is about how you live. Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Matthew 7:21. Then there's Paul, who taught that we're saved through Jesus' death. All we need is faith. Paul said, "For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law." Romans 3:28. From these two verses alone, we can see an apparent contradiction. Jesus teaches that we need to do God's will. Paul teaches that we just need to believe. Who's right? The law of Moses is the set of commandments that God gave to Israel through Moses. When Jesus came around after a millennium, he affirmed this law. He said, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Matthew 5:18. Paul, on the other hand, seems to do away with the law. Paul wrote, "For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace." Romans 6:14. From these two verses, we get another apparent contradiction. Jesus teaches that the law matters. Paul teaches that we no longer need it. Again, who's right? This right here is another one of the biggest arguments against Paul. Jesus taught openly, in public. In John 18:20, he says, "I have said nothing in secret." Paul, on the other hand, taught in private. In Galatians 2:2, he says, "I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles." From these two verses alone, we get an apparent contradiction in the way Jesus teaches versus the way Paul teaches. Does this prove that Paul can't be trusted? Well, hold your horses.
Paul preached a completely different religion to Jesus Christ.
I don't trust him. I don't like his writings. And I don't think that he was really aligned with what was written about Jesus.
Are they preaching the same religion?
The essential doctrine of who Jesus is, taught in the Gospels, is now further reiterated and fleshed out in Paul's teaching.
I think that the message of Jesus and the message of Paul are in fundamental agreement.
For the sake of this video, I plan to keep things short and simple. I'm not making an in-depth analysis of every single verse where Jesus and Paul contradict each other. I just want people to know the general idea behind the belief that Paul contradicts Jesus. And I also want people to see the other side of the argument. It's not as black and white as a few cherry-picked verses make it seem. Before we look at the other side of the debate, I just want to point out that only 5% of my viewers are currently subscribed. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Paul didn't create a new religion apart from Jesus. When Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven," Jesus isn't saying that some Christians won't make it to heaven. He's saying that good works can exist without salvation. People can do good things, prophesy in his name, and cast out demons in his name, without devoting their allegiance to God. Paul shows this when he writes, "If I have prophetic powers but have not love, I am nothing." 1 Corinthians 13:2. Although Paul writes this as a hypothetical, it shows that Paul clearly understood the idea that people need to devote themselves to love and that prophetic powers are not enough. Jesus himself said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Matthew 22:37-40. And Paul actually mirrors that by saying, "So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love." 1 Corinthians 13:13. Paul also shows his understanding that not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," is doing the will of God. He wrote that they profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. Titus 1:16. Now you might also be wondering about that verse where he says, "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Romans 10:9. At first glance, it seems like another contradiction, doesn't it? But once again, we have to remember what Jesus was actually saying in Matthew 7. He wasn't saying that people who confess that Jesus is Lord still won't be saved. Jesus and Paul are talking about different uses of confession. In Matthew 7, they're saying "Lord, Lord" in a defensive manner, appealing to their works as their justification, acknowledging that he is Lord now that they're seeing him on Judgment Day. In Romans 10, they're calling on the name of the Lord in an appeal to his saving grace. That distinction changes everything. Jesus wasn't necessarily contradicting Paul. Jesus was simply stating that people could use his name and yet have a heart that doesn't seek after him. Jesus said that not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. For added context, he also said this in the previous verse, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." What I really want you to note here is that Jesus came to fulfill the law. He said that himself. But what does that really mean? Well, we don't have a direct answer from Jesus himself. Many Christians actually fill in the gaps with teachings from Paul. Paul said that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Romans 10:4. Paul is not inherently contradicting Jesus. Paul's point is that righteousness is no longer achieved through adherence to the law, but through Christ. He's simply adding more explanation to what Jesus himself said. If Paul is right, then Jesus was the one who did away with the law, not Paul. This last point is actually fairly easy to argue. Jesus taught in public. Paul taught some things in private. This shows that Paul is not the same as Jesus. Whoop-de-doo. We already knew that. But seriously, on a deeper note, Jesus himself actually taught things in private. When he was speaking to the public, he did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything. Mark 4:34. But what about John 18:20, where he says, "I have said nothing in secret"? The key word to note here is secret. The Greek word that Jesus used here is crypto, and it means to hide, conceal, or keep secret. When Jesus spoke to his disciples in private, the word Mark used is kat idion. This word means in private, or apart. This distinction is important. Jesus actually never claimed that he never spoke to someone in private. That wouldn't make sense. Jesus simply claimed that he didn't conceal things from those who asked. And Paul was the same way. Paul said that he did not shrink from declaring to you anything that was profitable and teaching you in public and from house to house. Acts 20:20. Paul didn't conceal the truth from people. He simply spoke in private to people who had influence. A major interpretation is that he wanted to ensure that the leaders he was talking to would not undermine his mission of spreading the gospel by causing public division. But get this, Jesus did the same thing. In John 3, Jesus spoke to a man of influence named Nicodemus, and he did so privately, at night. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night. Maybe Jesus and Paul weren't all that different. The ideas I covered in this video are barely scratching the surface of the Jesus versus Paul debate. There are so many more arguments that people bring up against Paul, and there are a lot of arguments that people use to defend him. I made this video so Paul doubters could see that Christians have some valid reasons to trust Paul. And I also wanted to show believers the types of arguments that could be used against our Christian faith. I wanted to present truth and clarity to cut through all the confusion, and I hope that this video did exactly that. I'll be making more Jesus versus Paul videos in the future. If you want more on the subject, I've got a playlist for you here. Just click the link.